This is my usability goes to 11, a hacker's guide to user experience research. So to just give a little background, I started out as a script kiddie, DEF CON 17, just running around popping shit. Went to grad school and became a UX researcher, did a couple internships at Mozilla and Palo Alto Research Center, and my master's thesis focused on how to redesign the Tor Browser Bundle so that it would be a little more usable for non-experts. Basically, my focus was these things called privacy-enhancing technologies, and we'll get a little bit into the whole, privacy versus security terminology later on. And currently, I am a staff technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology in Washington, D.C. That basically means that I do Hill visits, occasionally doing some lobbying, but mostly I work on web standards and serving as an in-house expert for our advocacy. So to just give a high-level outline, we're going to talk about why usability is important. Why is usability hard? Why is usable security especially hard? And how we can evaluate our tools to see whether or not they're usable. And these all sound like relatively simple things, but they get hard very quickly. So to just sort of set us up terminology-wise, when we talk about security, we're usually basically talking about the CIA triad. We're talking about confidentiality. We're talking about integrity. Is this data being modified in transit? And we're talking about availability, non-repudiation, things like that. Privacy is just control over your personal information in general. If you don't have security, you're never going to get to privacy because someone else already has that control for you. And so these privacy-enhancing technologies are just any technology that lets you control your privacy. So something like Veracrypt that lets you encrypt your files, that could be a privacy-enhancing technology. Something like Tor is usually considered a privacy-enhancing technology. So at the high level, why even encourage pet adoption? Why shouldn't these people just RTFM? Why does making privacy usable matter? Well, we've extensively documented the existence of mass surveillance. And studies have shown that mass surveillance chills free speech. It chills what we talk about. It chills what we look at. This chilling effect has an effect on our democracy. If we want to have a republic, we have to have debate. Period. End of story. Why encourage adoption of these technologies? The math is good. If you look at the current surveillance practices, the so-called Five Eyes are mostly focusing on bulk collection and injection. We have great. I don't have the notes, but these NSA systems like Tempura, for example, where that was GCHQ. But when you're sucking up massive amounts of data, if that data is encrypted, it's not as useful. If the transmission of that data is using HTTPS or some sort of integrity check, it's much harder to modify in transit, much harder to shoot malware in there. We don't have any evidence that the more common encryption standards like AES or PGP have been subverted. There was, the NIST interestingness. So basically, we know that our underlying technologies are solid. We need to resist this urge to fall into what Mika Lee called security nihilism, and focus on making sure that the tools that we have are used by as many people as possible. And thirdly, we have the idea of network effects. Most of you may have heard of Metcalfe's law, the idea that the strength of a network is n to the power of 2, n being the number of users. This is especially true for anonymity systems. Again, in the community, sometimes we'll use the phrase RTFM when we're talking about something like, Linux. But when we're talking about a privacy tool is best when the most people can use it. So for example, with Tor, the bigger that swarm is, the less chance I have of knowing who you in particular are. On the other hand, as one of my friends from Pittsburgh said, nobody wants to download a special application to talk to Greg Norcie when I asked them to download Signal. Luckily, with certain recent events in the news, people have been more and more willing to use encryption. So why encourage adoption of these technologies? Because nothing to hide is a load. Everybody wants privacy. If you don't think that you want privacy in your life, see me after this talk so I can set up a Nest Cam in your bathroom. So we all want some privacy. We've set a floor. What we're talking about is the ceiling. So that brings us to our next point. If usability is so important, why don't we just add usability to these products? And that, when I was making these slides, reminded me of this Neil deGrasse quote. Obama authorized North Korean sanctions over cyber hacking, Solution there, it seems to me, is to create unhackable systems. Just like I think we in this community know by now that you can't simply bolt on security after you've designed a product. Similarly, you can't just come in at the end, throw your tool at a designer and say, hey, can you make this usable? It's not going to work. And usability is hard. We can define when a system is secure. If I send out a packet, we can do these entropy calculations. We can see how long it would take to decrypt this, given the key space, yada, yada. There's no real way to know, is this piece of software usable? It's just a continual and iterative process. And even when we ask users for feedback, it might not be helpful. I'm sure if you've ever developed an open source project, you get tired of complaints like this. Your usability is bad. I can't tell you why it's bad, but your product is hard to use and I don't like it. Now, you can do two things in this scenario. You can just double down and say RTFM and not try and actually improve your product, or you can use some sort of systematic way of improving the usability. And the other thing is that usable security is even harder than just trying to find something usable. Look how long we were listening to music with all sorts of weird technologies before we finally settled on the iPhone or the iPod. That was a very usable, easy way to have a ton of music at your disposal, and it took many, many years. And was this relatively old paper called Why Johnny Can't Encrypt that was put out by Alma Witten and J.D. Tiger back in 1999. And basically it was one of the first times that we said, hey, why don't we take this theory from HCI, human-computer interaction, which is an academic stream of research, and let's apply it to a security tool and see what pops out. And so Johnny can encrypt, according to Witten and Tiger, if he's made aware of the security tasks, able to figure out how to perform these tasks, doesn't make any dangerous errors, and feels sufficiently comfortable to continue using. And that last one is key. There's a phrase they use in the human-computer interaction literature. It's called the gulf of execution. And a great example might be when you're trying to set the timer on your VCR. And you know what your end goal is. You want to record the latest episode of Friends. And you know what your starting point is. You don't have a timer set. But you have no idea how to go from that start goal to the end goal. And if you can't logic your way towards it, you may just throw up your hands and say, you know what, I guess I'm just not going to see Friends this week. And Witten and Tiger operationalized some properties about usable security that make it especially hard to do. And I'm going to give each of these its own little slide to really delve in. The first is the unmotivated user property, and we had some projector issues. I wish this was bigger, but that is a tweet from Swift on security that says, tell me more about the crypto you invented, with Taylor Swift leaning into the children. The unmotivated user property talks about the fact that security isn't a primary task, that users aren't lazy, they're actually acting quite rationally. These are rational actors. Security is not something they want to do. Their time is of value and it is limited. So they are going to expend the least energy possible on your security system. This is why they're writing their passwords down. This is why they're using dictionary words as passwords. This is why they're doing all the bad things. It's not because they hate you. It's because they just have other things they want to do. They want to shop on Amazon. They want to send snarky tweets. And anything that gets in the way of that is an obstacle to be overcome. They're trying to hack your system. Second is the abstraction property. Programmers deal with abstraction all day. These concepts like public keys and signing and things like that, they're very intuitive to people like me, but they're not for our users. So for example, when a user goes to a coffee shop, they might feel secure because the coffee shop has a password on their Wi-Fi. What they may not understand is that is operating in pre-shared key mode, so therefore anyone else who has that password can just snarf up the packets and decrypt them. Third is the lack of feedback property. When my security is breached, I may not get any feedback that it's happened until my credentials are used or something bad happens. So for example, most people don't know they were on the wall of sheep until somebody logs into their system and messes with it. And finally, the barn door property. Just like after the horse runs out of the barn, it's futile to lock the gate. Secrets once leaked remain so forever. Small errors irreversible consequences. So, for example, with Dread Pirate Roberts, the guy who ran the Silk Road, he plugged the Silk Road at one point using his real Gmail address, which had his real name in there. The feds started monitoring his physical mail, and he had some fake IDs shipped to him with a bunch of names other than his legal one. So they go and talk to him. He says some suspicious stuff like, well, how do you know I ordered those? There's this site called the Silk Road that somebody could have sent them to me from as like a prank or something, which seems like a bit of an odd defense. So they put physical surveillance on him, and eventually they followed him to the San Francisco Public Library, where when he logged into the administration interface for the Silk Road, they just yanked the computer off of him and imaged it. Finally, the weakest link property. The network is only as strong as the weakest link, that's the user. An attacker only needs to find one unpatched system, and that unpatched system may be the person who clicks on a phishing link. So how can you make your privacy software more usable? The first is the idea of what I heard about when I was interviewing at IBM Design called the T-shaped designer. And the idea is to have a depth in one area and breadth in two. And the three areas they're talking about are user research, design in the more artistic sense, and software engineering. And usually what you'll see happen is when we're hiring engineers, we hire purely on software engineering. We don't really care about these other two qualities. And especially on open source projects, you may be the solitary developer or only one or two developers on a project. So you may have somebody who's a crypto expert who's doing the crypto. You have a networking guy who's doing some networking modules, and everything's just sort of going to fit together at the end. And that's just, usability is not just a module that you can have somebody off coding in a corner and bring to the table at the end. So let's say you decide that you want your project to be usable, but you're experiencing this gulf of execution. You have the will to make your project usable, but you don't necessarily understand how you can do that. That's what the majority of this talk is going to be about. And there's two different techniques you can really use that we're going to talk about. The first is no. Oh, wonderful. Clicker decided not to work. There's two techniques you can use. The first is called a cognitive walkthrough. Really? Okay. The first is called a cognitive walkthrough, and you can do that just as a solitary researcher, or you can do a full-blown lab study. And I'm actually going to talk about both. I actually have a case study that we're going to share from some of my own research. So cognitive walkthrough is pretty simple. You're just going to sit down. You're going to think of some of the tasks that you would want to do when you're using this software and ask yourself, are the users going to be able to produce the effect this action has? Are users going to see the control that they need to click on? Once users find this control, are they going to realize that it produces the effect that they want? And after that action taken, will users understand the feedback they get? So basically, you just come up with a set of tasks that you need to accomplish. You go through the interface, thinking critically about how you could go, what could go wrong, or what would be confusing, and you just sort of document the process along the way. And you can usually find most of the high-level usability issues just by doing this. But it does have some problems because, again, you are an expert. You're probably the person who designed the system, and you're going to have some blind spots about what may be hard to use. So to give you an idea, when we say core tasks, there was a paper by Jeremy Clark and a few others called Usability of Anonymous Web Browsing, which was the first examination of Tor usability. And this was the study that led to the creation of the Tor Browser Bundle, that they looked at all these different ways you could set up Tor, Privoxy, command line, et cetera, and unsurprisingly came to the conclusion that the most usable way of setting up Tor was to have some sort of integrated browser that you just started up and Tor is encapsulated within it. So their core tasks were just to install Tor, configure Tor, confirm that the traffic is being anonymized, which is always a good thing, and then successfully disable Tor and return to a direct connection. Because back then, everybody is really big on the Tor button extension. The idea was that we're going to be browsing in our normal browsing. We're going to click this Tor button extension, turn on Tor, do some stuff, and turn it off. We now know that that's kind of dangerous. We now know that's not the best idea, and it's better to have a separate browser. But that was the state of the art at the time. And that was actually considered really usable, that you could just click something in the UI and not just be messing around on the terminal. So then if we can get like 80% of the way there without having to do a big user study, why do one? Because that whenever you come into the rest of your developers and say, I came up with the usability issues, you're going to get like, well, yeah, it's just your opinion, man. You think we should make these changes. I think they should read the manual. We got two opinions, 50-50. Which way should we go? Here's a hint. They're probably going to want to go the way that doesn't require any more coding. And then, you know, you're an expert. If you understand the system, you're going to see things differently. So, for example, Charlie here has a box of hornets. And he's saying, you know what? I'm going to pop a little H here on this box so everyone knows that it's full of hornets. And these are the kinds of errors that you can make if you, as an expert, try and design an interface, because you have this intimate knowledge of the system. So we're going to talk about a case study. This was actually a master's thesis I did when I was in grad school. You know, I know, you know, I'm not a big fan of school either, but when it comes to doing usability, it's actually really useful to have some background in experimental psychology, anthropology, things like that. You know, I'm not sure if doing a PhD was the best move. Getting a master's and dropping out probably was, though. So just to give a really quick overview, just in case not everybody in the room is familiar with Tor, it's basically this anonymity service that uses onion routing technology. It was originally developed by the Navy. The Navy realized if you have an anonymity network that is only used by people in the Navy, maybe if I don't know which particular person in the Navy is using Tor, we know someone in the Navy is visiting my website, and that might be problematic. So they decided to expand the pool. It got taken over by the EFF for a while, and funded, that is, and is now its own 501c3 nonprofit. And the basic idea is that you're routing your traffic through three nodes, the entry node, middle node, and exit node, to mask your identity. And you should note when using Tor that your content is not encrypted when it's exiting the network unless you're using HTTPS or something. So, you know, you're just going to get a list of Tor nodes from a directory server. You're going to go through your path. And then every 10 minutes, you're actually switching circuits, and each website gets its own circuit. So if I'm using The Guardian in one tab and I'm looking at the Washington Post in the other, you don't necessarily know that I'm looking at both those websites. There had been some previous research on Tor usability, but they basically just did this cognitive walkthrough, said put it in a bundle, and then did the whole mission accomplished and fly off in a helicopter. Typical of academic research. So the original Tor Browser Bundle at the time we were doing this was a custom Firefox build. They also included Vidalia that was doing the proxy management, and then it had the Tor button extension built in, which allows you to turn the Tor Browser Bundle on and off. So just to sort of give a timeline about when all this went out, we did the first of the two studies back in 2012. We ended up at this little conference in Spain, which I did not know this until they showed up, but most of the Tor developers went there as well. So when I was giving this original research, I had like Roger Dingledine sitting in the front row. So then we spoke with Tor. They actually ended up making some changes to the UI, and then we developed a custom extension to do some of the changes that weren't being put in. And then we actually did a second usability study where we just verified, because at the time I was in grad school, it wasn't good enough to just, you know, improve an open source project. You had to make it like a full-blown scientific experiment. So, you know, and we did find out that well, I'll just get to that later. So yeah, two studies, about the same number of students download and install the Tor Browser Bundle. At the time of the second study, the Tor Browser Bundle had done several changes. Most importantly, they had dropped Vidalia, which, as we'll see later, having Vidalia in the mix really just created a lot of weird issues, and rolled that functionality into the Tor Browser Bundle so that there was only one window for Tor at any given time. And the way we went about this was actually pretty simple. We passed out consent forms and study sheets. This was an IRB-approved study, and I'm not going to get into that in detail, but basically, you know, it's not considered ethical to just take somebody's lab section and say, congratulations, I'm going to experiment on you. We get a consent for the experimentation, and if they had not wanted to participate in the experiment, they had to be free to do something else instead. So we let them like write an essay on how Tor works or something like that if they didn't feel comfortable doing this. We briefed them that this wasn't a typical lab. So normally if we're doing a lab for this class, they have some sort of task they have to work through on their own. It would actually be considered cheating to just, ask the person sitting next to them for the answer, ask the TA for the answer. So we tell them that each time you encounter an issue, just raise your hand and I'm going to come over and tell you how to fix it. And then when I did this, I would say, please just write down the issue you had because we want to catalog all the issues that the software is encountering. And then this is the really interesting part, because how do you move from a list of complaints to something that you can work with? And they have this thing in psychology they refer to as coding responses, but they're talking about coding them in the sense of coding them into categories. So what you do is you get two people to independently come up with a list of categories. You agree on, the intersection of those, or the union of those becomes this final category list after you talk a bit and make sure you're not overlapping. And then both coders independently read through each issue and decide to assign it to a category. And then you can actually generate what's called Cohen's kappa, which is just basically a fancy way of making sure that the amount of agreement between the two coders was more than you would expect from random chance. Because you don't want a situation where, we're both just completely going wild. And so we came up with a bunch of issues. But it's really hard to read that graph. So I've also got a pie chart. And the big takeaway that we found was that about 57% of the issues boil down to 3 distinct usability issues. You change these 3 things, and hypothetically, you can cut the usability issues in half. And we're going to go in detail into each of these. The first was the concept of long launch time. Where's that pointer? Oh, so you'll make a laser, but you won't go forward. Interesting. So on the old version of Tor, when you clicked to start Tor, you would be told you're now connected to the Tor network. And at this point, users would go, yay, I'm on Tor. I can, be anonymous. The problem was that only the Tor Browser Bundle window was anonymous. Nothing else was. So let's say I had previously had Chrome open, and I'm being told I'm connected to Tor. Okay, I'm going to hop into Chrome, log into Facebook, and organize a protest, and probably get shot because I was not anonymous when I did that. So our proposed solution was to alter. We actually didn't think high enough. We said you should just alter the lag so that you didn't have this situation where Vidalia was popping up and then there was a long delay until the window opened. And the Tor project actually just rolled all of this functionality into the Tor button extension. The second issue we encountered was browsing delay. And then this becomes a little bit harder because people are basically complaining Tor is slow. There have been entire DEF CON talks about the fact that Tor is slow, and Roger Dingelnheim assures us he's working on it. And the thing about this is that you're just never going to be as fast routing your traffic through a series of nodes as you will if you were doing a straight shot. So then it becomes more of a communication issue. How can we make users aware of this trade-off? There's been some research that users are more willing to do some sacrifices if they're explicitly using privacy enhancing technologies. And also it's just like in general, if you're in a coffee shop, you might not be as angry you can't use Netflix than if you were at home. It's about setting expectations. So we came up with these warning dialogues that could pop up when Tor was experiencing a large amount of latency and say, due to security, and there was research that basically shows if you tell somebody we're doing this for security, they'll tolerate all sorts of stuff. Proof of that, for example, lies within the TSA. So Tor knows you're experiencing delay. We apologize. Thank you for your patience. Hypothetically, if they're being shown this, they're not going to be as angry. And then the third thing was when the users were window discriminability. So these users aren't sure which window was the Tor Browser Bundle. Well, at the time, it was a custom Firefox build in that they even still had the Firefox logo. So if you've got Firefox open, you've got the Tor Browser Bundle window open, you're not really sure which is which if you go off into another application. So they ended up developing this really nice logo, really sleek. I really like how it's not focused directly on the US, directly on the Asia, like trying to show the entire world. Nice little artistic license there. So what happened after we made these did this study? And so between the two studies, the number of people who just said no problems, because I guess I should backtrack a little and say that we, at one point, one guy got to the end of the thing, and he's like, I didn't have any issues. I'm like, are you sure? Because if you didn't have any issues, that's a valid data point. We don't want to discourage you. We just didn't want a situation where the entire class said, oh yeah, I didn't have any issues, and then walked out after 2 minutes. And we probably would have just discarded that result. But there was double the amount of people after we made these changes who said, oh, I'm not actually experiencing any usability issues. We also had an across-the-board reduction in these usability issues. So long launch time went down, but everything went down at least a little. Wow, this went through a lot quicker than I thought. So just to kind of summarize, usability is this uniquely hard problem. You should try and hire these T-shaped designers who also have experience with UX research and UX design. And that doesn't mean that they have to be experts. It just means that they have to have a passing familiarity. Cognitive walkthroughs can help suss out usability issues, even if your project has minimal resources. And you should talk to your users. Usability is not a one-time operation. You need to revisit this periodically. And finally, you may be sitting here thinking about what you can do next. And I would recommend that you read the paper, Why Johnny Can't Encrypt. You read Users Are Not the Enemy by Angela Sasse, which we were talking about earlier. You read Why Johnny Can't Blow the Whistle, which is the paper that I was just discussing. There's an entire human-computer interaction bibliography that has a bunch of free papers. And also just, come up with a few things you want to read on your own. The thing I really want to push in this talk, that usability is not a checklist. This is not, I think any DEF CON attendee who I pulled out of the hallway would probably, if I said, are you sick of security being a checklist, they would nod furiously that, we don't want this to have like the equivalent of the PCI standards for usability, where we're just checking boxes. We've done this, we've done that. We did a cognitive walkthrough. We actually want to have usability. I'm just going to back up because I thought I accidentally skipped something, but I guess I didn't. So I just moved through these a lot faster than I intended. But that does mean we have some extra time for questions. If anybody has any. So go ahead.
So a friend of mine are working on trying to make .onion addresses a little more readable and kind of like less fishable. Have you seen anything along the lines of like using n-grams to like have address identifiers? So basically, instead of just like hash.onion, it would just be like a series of like 5 words based on like a matrix derived by that. So you're just like seeing like, horse, stable, car, cat.
So the question is if I've heard of anything that would make .onion addresses a little easier to read, a little less phishable, because if I can know this is the site I'm going to. I haven't seen anything specifically related to .onion addresses. I've seen some really interesting schemes. For example, Mozilla had a thing up, I think it was like about a month ago, where they were talking about this idea of using emojis as ciphers, that like you can use chunks of characters equals this emoji, one chunk of characters equals that. So that could be something that you could do. You could try and translate this long string of characters into a series of pictures. Or, it could be as simple as trying to display it in chunks. Like there's been some research that people usually can only remember 5 plus or minus 2, 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. So if you can split the onion up, just adding dashes. If you can just visually separate that out a little bit so that people can check 4 at a time, that can be helpful.
Do you find it, and this is not entirely unrelated to David's question, is it helpful to do usability prototyping in parallel to technical prototyping? Like a meaningful approach.
I mean, generally, like if I had the perfect idea, is like you have like a general idea of what your software product is going to be, and you can write backend stuff beforehand, But if you would want to have like at least a general idea going in of what the flow is going to be, and that doesn't necessarily mean the interface specifically. Like, but if I was going to write like the next Veracrypt, I would at least know a basic flow of like somebody's going to create a container, put things in the container, open the container, things like that. That you would want to try and come up with these flows early on, and then yes, you could try and develop a little bit in parallel. Because I can think of a number of scenarios where you're going to be working out the kinks in something on the low level and then be able to be in parallel working on the high level UI. You might not be coding up the final UI, but you can at least be planning it out.
Well, sort of as a follow-up, it's like there's a trade-off between what is like if you build a security system or a protocol or whatever that's very secure, but it's completely inherently unusable. Like we don't have a research solution to usability challenges. It doesn't really help it. So like that's sort of like angle I was coming at it is like, should I constrain the way I'm developing other parts of the protocol by usability research?
Well, usually what you can try and do is it's always possible to offer like a simple UI and then have something that you can click on to go into these sort of advanced options for the user who wants to. Because the problem is like what you present to the user will be clicked on. So if you bury some of the more complicated stuff in the UI, the things that only the experts are going to need, if somebody's truly an expert, they might not even be doing these things in the UI to begin with. They might be using the command line version anyways.
Did you have any people who were in both studying on the instant?
No, so these were 2 different semesters. So this was like, the fall of, I forget when, but it was like, let's say fall of 2012, fall of 2013. It was 2 separate classes. Yeah, so Signal and Tor are both good. Trying to think. Veracrypt's doing better. Not perfect, but doing better than TrueCrypt used to.
What are the next steps for the Tor browser from design perspective, like the style sheet, things like that?
Well, now you're starting to get into the harder things. Like one of the things the paper talked about was that we didn't really go into in this talk because I thought I was going to be pressed for time, was there was a lot of security warning confusion, and you can do entire papers just on how to design one security dialog. But that can be, confusing for people. You don't see this error as much, but when people would get mixed content errors, so you would have it where parts of the page were HTTPS encrypted and parts weren't, and you would often get those when you were doing the Google CAPTCHA, that the image for the CAPTCHA actually was going over plain HTTP and the rest of the page wasn't. So there's a lot of times where you'll get these really advanced warnings that it's just, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what this warning means. So there's a lot of room for improvement there. But it's one of those things where, they've gotten very, very good UX and the remaining problems are really hard ones.
While iterating on a design, so you'll often try to expose some of the things that you think might be more important to the average user. You're talking about hiding advanced things behind advanced screens. Yet, how do you deal with people that when they get release 1 and then release 2, and the things that they're expecting to configure privacy settings have moved around based on that user research? How do you handle that when it's not really plausible to maintain both code paths?
Sure. So that's an interesting point because then basically you've got this, the bake-in. I forget what the technical term would be. Like something like, for example, when Microsoft Office moved to the ribbon, you can. The ribbon is probably more intuitive for somebody who's never used Microsoft Office before, but for somebody who is used to a very specific set of actions to get very specific responses, having to relearn the UI. I think that you basically have to decide that there is going to be this sort of switching cost, for lack of a better term, of switching to a more usable UI, and you can make sure you have some documentation available so that if somebody is having trouble finding their tasks, that they're not just left out in the cold. Maybe not just and really like I think when Tor set out the browser bundle and when they dropped the daily and things like that, they do like a blog with every release that details what's been changed, and if you're doing major changes, you can try and have some help.